Now I'd like to introduce our morning speaker. We're incredibly fortunate to have Professor Chris Trimble with us today. He's a global leader on this crucial topic for the church, innovation in existing organizations. His award-winning research has borne fruit in numerous books and articles, including his landmark book, The Other Side of Innovation, and I encourage you to pick up a copy and read through it. His questions about how innovation works in large organizations arose through his experience as a nuclear submarine officer in the United States Navy. Frustration with the challenges of creating innovation within the military, he went to Tuck School of Management at Dartmouth to seek answers. Joining the faculty upon graduation, Chris spent a decade researching innovation in large corporations, seeking to understand the dynamics of successful innovation. In addition to his work on the faculty at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, he recently joined the Dartmouth Center for Healthcare Delivery Science and is immersed in a multi-year effort to apply his work to the specific challenge of innovation in healthcare delivery. My father-in-law, Paul Batalden, is an emeritus professor of pediatrics and of healthcare improvement at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth. He met Chris Trimble a few years ago and immediately made the connection between Chris's work on innovation and things I had shared with him about innovation in churches, and specifically things I was learning in conversation with Chris Nelson and the interesting things going on through Bethlehem Lutheran. So Chris had not had the opportunity to connect his research on innovation to the church context, but he was open to do it when I invited him. He'll tell us some of his own story growing up in and then away from active participation in the church, while over the same period his mother attended seminary and began a second career as an Episcopal priest. He will think with us about the struggles in mainline Christianity and the opportunities before us if, as Dirk suggested in his keynote yesterday, we ask about the needs of the neighbor. If I may put it sharply, Chris Trimble is just such a neighbor, one who is disconnected from the church and whose story and wisdom we need to listen to very carefully if we are to discern our mission in a time of change. Chris, it's our honor to have you here. Welcome.
Good morning. Chris, thank you. I enjoyed our dinner with you and colleagues last night, and I already feel very, very welcome in this community, and I thank you for that. When I was 13 years old, my parents told me it was time to go to confirmation classes. As Chris mentioned, I grew up in an Episcopalian family. As it turns out, there was a good friend of mine in the same class. We both were on the middle school track team. Our families were friendly, and so we spent a lot of time together. And I remember one thing vividly about the class, and that was when we were asked to share some kind of personal story. I don't remember my friend's story except for how it ended. He ended by saying, "And that's when I knew that I had experienced Christ in my life." And I must admit, I looked at him and I thought, "Who are you?" Church was always that way for me, to be candid with you. I didn't hate going, but it was always foreign. It didn't resonate. I didn't, quote, get it. A few years later, over dinner, my mother made an announcement. She said, "I've decided to become a priest." Sure enough, she began seminary at the same time I went off to college. Despite our very distinct religious pathways in life, my parents and I have a great relationship, and I've watched her work, and I've talked to her about her work, and I've come to understand what she does. Her work is to lead, to inspire, to comfort, to heal, to counsel, to create community, to help people find their way, to address the big questions, and to be present at the most important moments in people's lives. This is good work, to be sure. And so I say very sincerely that I'm grateful for the invitation to be here today. Okay, so let's get to work. I've got a graph to share with you. On the horizontal axis is age. On the vertical axis is number of people. And we can use this graph to visualize the age distribution of a population. Let's give that a try with the beloved Minnesota Vikings. Okay. Nobody below 19 or so, peak in the 20s, slow decline in the 30s, almost nobody above 40 in a typical year. Okay. Now what I'd like you to do is to think silently about what you imagine this distribution looks like for the members of your church. Okay. I don't know, but I'm told qualitatively that for a whole lot of churches, the distribution looks something like this. It hasn't always been this way, I'm told, if you go back a couple of generations. It looks more like this. Okay. This begs the question, what will it look like in the future? Now, as I pose the question, I'm nagged by the old saw that some things are hard to predict, especially the future. Nonetheless, I think we can make this statement with near mathematical precision, and that is, if the church fails to attract the young and the currently unchurched, the future distribution will look something like this. Okay? Now, as Chris mentioned, I'm doing a little bit of study of healthcare right now, and there's a term for a graph that looks like this in healthcare: flatlining. Okay? Now, if you think this is disturbing, I want you to contemplate something that might be even scarier. Okay? This is a different graph. On the horizontal axis, we have time. On the vertical axis, we have church giving, or let's call it revenue, either one. Now, a church on the trajectory we've just described might follow a trajectory of giving that looks like this. That's because most giving comes from older members of the church, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. Note that a church on the trajectory we described on the last slide won't really experience much of a fall-off in giving for a long time, and then you'll get to a tipping point where the decline becomes sharper and much steeper. This, folks, is what I call a fiscal cliff. Okay? And you cannot let this happen. Now, what I'm going to do today is share some stories about companies that have experienced similar challenges to what you're facing. Some have failed, some have succeeded, and we'll try and disentangle a little bit about why. Probably many of you have heard of this company, Encyclopedia Britannica. Back in the 1980s, this company had an absolute lock on its market. And it did so well because it had mastered 3 core skills. First, they had world-class content. If they wanted the best possible article on biomedical engineering, by gosh, they went out and found the Nobel Prize winner and got that person to write the article. Second, they took enormous care in the appearance of the books themselves. They had experts that knew everything about how the books looked, how they felt, even how they smelled when you opened them for the first time. Okay? Third, they were world-class at door-to-door sales. No company was as good as they were at convincing parents that their kids needed encyclopedias to get a good education. Now, in the early 1990s, Microsoft came along and they knocked at the door of Encyclopedia Britannica. And they said, we'd like to engage you in a partnership. Encyclopedia Britannica declined. They said, not our business. Microsoft was undeterred. They went to what was decidedly a second-tier competitor, one with dramatically inferior quality. They signed a partnership with that company. They took their content, they jazzed it up with some multimedia sound and video and graphics, put it in a box with a CD-ROM inside. It was called Encarta, and they sold it for $50. Now, pretty soon, Encyclopedia Britannica realized they had a problem. And they formed a strategic task force to decide what to do. And the task force studied the problem, and they decided that indeed it was time for Encyclopedia Britannica to enter the digital age. Okay? And so they took all their content and they put it on CD-ROMs. And they even gave those CD-ROMs away for free, just so long as you first paid $3,000 for the books. If you wanted just the CD-ROMs, they'd sell it to you for $1,500. Their argument was that their content was just that much superior. The rest, as they say, is history. Encyclopedia Britannica was out of business within just a few years. The content lives on, but the company, sadly, did not. I'd like you to take just 30 seconds or so to think silently about what you think went wrong. And it's totally okay to speculate a little bit. Put yourself inside that boardroom with the people that were running that organization. What happened? What went wrong? Well, there's a lot of things that might have gone wrong. Maybe they just didn't understand their customers. Maybe they thought of their market too narrowly in the terms of books instead of information. But I want to call your attention to what it must have felt like to the experts that work there. If you are great at writing outstanding content, how do you feel about a dumbed-down version of the encyclopedia? If you know everything there is to know about books and how to make them look elegant and feel elegant and smell elegant, how do you feel about a cardboard box that's shrink-wrapped and sold at retail? If you are the best door-to-door salesman the company has, how do you feel about retail, period? Okay. The world changed around Encyclopedia Britannica in a way that made their core areas of expertise irrelevant. Okay. And it happened so quickly that it would have been one of the most heroic business success stories ever if they had managed to turn it around. This was a near impossible challenge. That said, what you face in the Lutheran Church has some similarities. I don't imagine that Microsoft is going to come along with a blue box and harm you. Okay? However, sometimes slow and steady change can be even more dangerous than sudden and sharp change. And to illustrate this, I'll hope you'll forgive me, but I want to go back to 10th grade biology, where some wisecrack in my class asked, "How do you boil a frog?" Apparently, if you throw it in boiling water, he'll jump right out. But if you put it in cool, comfortable water and turn on the heat, the frog will slowly fall asleep and then die. The only hope for that frog is to fight off the comfort of slumber and summon the courage to jump. Now, I often say when I speak to organizations that no organization survives forever without innovation. I must say the church may be coming the closest to proving me wrong on that one. Okay? Got a history. I know of no other industry where the business model dates back centuries. And if you want to be flexible about what business model means, you could even say millennia. Okay? And yet, here we are, having this conversation. One of the challenges of my field is that it's very hard to get a group of people to agree on what innovation is. If you are a dreamer, innovation is about a brilliant insight, a creative inspiration, a light bulb moment. If you're a scientist, maybe innovation is about a technological breakthrough. If you're a corporate strategist, innovation might be a clever way to destroy the competition. All of these overlook what innovation really is at its core. Okay? What an innovation is a solution to a problem. It is a solution to a problem. Okay? So the very first thing you do when you innovate is not hold a creative brainstorming session. It's not run an experiment in the lab. It's not tinker with the music in the worship service. It is to define the problem. What is the problem that we're trying to address? Okay? That's the very first question. Now, in business terms, we talk about this as market research. Who's your customer? What's the problem that you can help solve? I'll do my best to translate to church language. What is the unmet need of the unchurched that you can address? This is where innovation begins. This is where it starts. Let me give you just 30 seconds now to imagine a neighbor who doesn't come to your church, and to see if you can imagine an unmet need of theirs that your church might be able to address. This is where innovation begins. All right. For the purposes of stimulating your thinking about this question, I'm going to take a bit of a personal risk here, and I'm going to share a bit of my own story. Not my story today, but the story about who I was in my 20s. And I choose that era in my life because I understand that the 20s are one area where you're very interested in stimulating growth in church membership. Back in the 20s, I was definitely, in my 20s, I should say, not the 1920s. Back in the 1920s, I was unchurched. But I had unmet needs. Okay? I had, for starters, big questions. Okay? Who am I? Okay? What is my purpose on this planet? Why is my job making me miserable? What is love? More to the point, why doesn't she love me back? And of course, the eternal mystery, how can it possibly be that flammable and inflammable mean the same thing? Now, is there a church program or service that you could invent that would help someone unchurched address those questions? It doesn't seem improbable to me. There's certainly some common interest expressed in those questions: the search for truth and wisdom, the search for meaning in life, the desire to be a better person. Let me up the ante on the challenge just a little bit more, because I think it's helpful to understand how I experienced church in some specific ways in my youth. Okay? First, it's probably useful to know that I'm an extreme introvert. Okay? And so walking into a building with hundreds of people to ponder the big questions in life, right off the bat, to me at least, that's a peculiar idea. Okay? Number two, I'm inspired by questions far more than I'm inspired by answers. So services where a creed, we believe and we believe, is a big feature, or services where the same story is repeated again and again, to me, that seems a little strange. Number three, according such a monopoly on truth and wisdom to one book, when there are so many great books with so much wisdom, feels restrictive. Again, to me. Okay. Number four, words like faith and worship and prayer, they just don't resonate with me. I don't know if they might someday, but you're going to have a hard time starting there with me. Number five, the notion that you could be good without God, to me, is less a provocative book title than a self-evident truth. I'm being candid with you. I'm taking a bit of a personal risk here. This is who I am. Let me ask again, can you imagine a program or a service that your creative community could create that might address those needs? Now, I'm going to guess some of you are thinking, Chris, you are so far out there. Maybe not. Maybe there's another church for you. And let me be very clear that that's okay. Okay? You shouldn't try to be, and you can't be, all things to all people. Okay? On the other hand, if somebody had said to me, Chris, we've got a great program that combines great books, conversations with people older and wiser than you, and maybe throw in some outdoor activities like hiking or cycling or cross-country skiing back in my 20s, you'd have had me at hello. Maybe that's not too far out of reach. My point is not to tell you that this is what you should be doing. My point is to illustrate a methodology. Heck, you could create that service. It could be the worst idea in the world. It could be that I'm an odd bird and I'm the only person that service would appeal to. That's entirely possible. I'm not presenting a solution. I'm presenting a methodology. Innovation begins by trying to understand the unmet needs of the unchurched. I'll go a little bit further here. One of those big questions that I really could have used help with back in my 20s was, why doesn't she love me back? And it's not that I didn't have people that I could talk to about that question or other big questions. I had plenty of friends. I had close friendships that I valued. Problem was, they were as clueless as I was. Okay? It was definitely a case of the blind leading the blind. Now, I picked up a script for love and romance some point in my youth. It has an awful lot in common with a few different movie scripts, particularly a couple of John Cusack movies. Okay. Part of that script was certainly to shower my loved one with gifts and affection and attention, and I did that as well as it could be done, and she left me anyway. Took me a good decade to figure out a big chunk of the answer. See, I was wrapped up in my script and my needs, and I never flipped the perspective around and tried to diagnose her needs and her script. My version of love wasn't so much love as self-love. Now, I tell you this story because, believe it or not, there are dozens of business stories that teach exactly the same lesson. Okay? When companies become too enamored of their script, their products, what they know how to do, they lose sight of the other side of the equation, the people they're serving and their needs and how those needs are changing. Consider Polaroid company. Great company at one time, great technologists, great products. Unfortunately, at no point in that company's history did they ever try and match their expertise in technology with expertise in figuring out what people want. Polaroid loved their cameras, not their customers. And as a result, they went bankrupt. If you want to attract the unchurched, you have to love your potential customers, not your camera. Okay? You can't look inward and think, how do we change our programs? How do we change our services? You have to look outward and try and diagnose the needs of the unchurched. You can't simply open the door and put a welcome sign out and hope that people will come in. You can't simply evangelize. Think about what evangelizing is. It is a focus on your script and, dare I say it, your needs. The term reverse evangelism came into the conversation as I was getting ready for this event. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Reverse evangelism starts with investigating. What do you need, you the unchurched? And then working backwards. What problems can we solve for you? Okay. Now, the good news is that some companies do this very, very well. And I'm going to share two examples with you. Okay. The first is from the neighboring state of Wisconsin. The company is Harley-Davidson. Yes, I really am here to suggest that you, the Lutheran Church, has something in common with Harley-Davidson. Please bear with me. I had a chance to interview the Chief Innovation Officer at Harley-Davidson, a woman named Laura Lee. And by studying those potential Harley-Davidson customers who were not joining the Harley community, she discovered that many people felt rather intimidated by the community. For me, it's not too hard to imagine why. Right? She found a whole lot of people who were interested but intimidated. So what did she do? She launched a whole series of new services. She organized rookie nights at dealerships, where if you already owned a Harley-Davidson or a motorcycle at all, you were not allowed in the door. Only rookies were allowed in, and they were encouraged to ask the stupidest questions imaginable. She set up a whole set of riding services, introductory lessons for motorcycling that were Harley-Davidson branded. She even set up a travel and tourism operation where groups of newcomers to the community went on trips together. By doing so, she created a comfortable pathway for the interested but intimidated. And I wonder if there's an analogy here for you. I wonder how many of the unchurched are not quite so far out there as I am, right? Okay? They're interested but intimidated. And what kind of services could be created for that group? The second example is even closer to home. Okay? It's from a company right here in the Twin Cities. The company's Thomson Reuters. Okay? That company is headquartered in London in the UK, but the legal publishing division is right here. This is the company that publishes those elegant-looking books that you find in law offices. Okay? Already you might imagine that this story has some similarities to Encyclopedia Britannica. And in fact, over a 3-year period, from 1996 to 1999, legal research went online. 3 years, from 0 to 100, thereabouts. Happy to tell you that Thomson Reuters navigated this transition perfectly. They came out ahead, and they continue to grow today. If I had to attribute it to just one aspect of their organization, it would be that they are absolutely maniacs about diagnosing the needs of their customers and their potential customers. And I'd like to give you just one illustration of that I'd like to stick. If you are a product developer at Thomson Reuters, the legal publishing division, you spend a substantial fraction of your time each quarter literally shadowing a lawyer through their workday and watching exactly how they go through the work of doing legal research, especially what they do just before and just after they access the Thomson Reuters databases. That's commitment. That's what it takes to understand the unmet needs of the people that you serve. Okay? How many of you are spending at least 5% of your time or your staff's time focused on an effort to diagnose the unmet needs of the unchurched? Okay. Once you diagnose that unmet need, I think the most exciting phase of innovation comes next. That's coming up with an idea. How do we address that need? That's the creative part. That's the part that gets people excited. We're going to skip right over that part. Okay? And the reason is, I know that you're all smart and creative people, and if you properly diagnose an idea, you'll come up with a good response. But coming up with that idea, well, that's not the whole challenge. And to get you thinking about that, I'm going to share a short story with you. And here you have a job. Okay? I'm going to tell you almost the whole story, and then I'm going to stop and give you a chance to imagine how the story ends. Now, this isn't a story about an organization. It's a story about a group of mountain climbers that was making their very first effort to get to the summit of this mountain. This is Mount Rainier in the northwest United States. Now, believe it or not, even though this mountain, as you can see, is covered with snow and ice and glaciers, more than 10,000 people make the effort to get to the summit each and every year. It may be the world's most difficult climb that is actually accessible to novices. You or I, we could do this with a few months of training and just so long as we were accompanied by an expert guide. Now, our climbers woke up just a few minutes after midnight. That's when you have to start the hike if you're going to do it safely. Okay. They hardly slept at all, but they were alert, they were exhilarated, they were ready to go. This was a day they had been dreaming about for a long, long time. Now, as it turned out, the first hour of the climb was not so hard, but each subsequent hour got a little bit more difficult. Finally, at the crack of dawn, our climbers got their first glimpse of the summit of Mount Rainier, and it was exactly as they had imagined it. It was majestic, it was inspiring, it was glistening in the morning sun, and so our climbers focused their energies inward, and they concentrated on each step. But with each additional step, their labors grew more difficult. Muscles ached, the air got thinner, the climbers got dizzy, and some began to contemplate the very real possibility that they might not make it. Well, I'm happy to tell you that this was a determined group, and they made it to the summit of Mount Rainier, and when they got there, they were jubilant. Because to be on top of this mountain is to feel like you are on top of the world. The city of Seattle lies some 14,000 plus feet directly below. But you know what? The journey for this group of climbers wasn't over yet. Why not? Yeah, they still had to get back down, right? And in fact, the expert guides were very well aware of the reality that the descent from Mount Rainier is the far more dangerous part of the journey. And now that may sound strange. If you walk up the stairs in this building, you'll find that's harder than coming back down. If you walk up the hills in the Twin Cities, are there any hills in the Twin Cities? Anyway, if you find a hill and you walk up it, you'll find that's harder than coming back down. But Mount Rainier is different. Okay? It is a dangerous mountain, one that claims a few lives each and every year. That's because snow on the surface of the glacier can collapse into interior caves and tunnels. Giant chunks of ice can suddenly break away, and climbers can fall into a deep crevasse and never be seen again. Now, making matters worse is the reality that the dangers only go up as the day goes on. Okay? It's because the sun gets higher and the snow gets softer, and more than anything else, because the climbers get more and more fatigued and more likely to make a big mistake. Now, here's the interesting thing. No matter how many times the experts warn the novices of the dangers of the descent, they always do the same thing. They celebrate at the summit. Their big dream at that point has been fulfilled, and everything else is a mere afterthought. And so it was that our climbers, having invested very little emotional energy in the descent, and having very little physical energy remaining, took their first few steps down Mount Rainier. I'll leave it for you now to imagine how this story ends. Show of hands, how many imagine that the climber survived? Good, almost everyone. You all are clearly optimists. But that's not the point of the story. Okay? The point of the story is this. There is a Mount Rainier-like summit in every innovation journey. And it's that moment when you say, by gosh, that's a fantastic idea. That's a perfect response to the unmet need that we worked so hard to diagnose. Okay? Let's go forward. Let's make things happen. And of course, getting to that summit can be a lot of hard work. And when you get there, it can feel fantastic. Okay? But as it is with Mount Rainier, you'll find all the hidden dangers and all the unanticipated pitfalls on the other side. So what we're going to do for the rest of our time together is to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty. We're going to quit imagining that innovation is about creativity and magic and find out what the other side of innovation is really all about. And one thing I've observed over the years is organizations spend way too little time thinking about the other side of innovation. Maybe that's because the hunt for the big idea is so exciting. Maybe that's because we like to put idea people on a pedestal. Whatever the reason, nowhere is the lack of sophistication of thinking about the other side of innovation more evident in the glib way that many business organizations talk about creating a so-called culture of innovation. Okay? A culture of innovation. Now, what's a culture of innovation? Well, what that means in the minds of business people far and wide is that everybody can be an innovator every day. Everybody can come up with ideas, everybody can take initiative. Okay? And that's powerful. That can work. In fact, that can generate thousands of ideas. But then you have to ask yourself the question, how are we going to move any of these ideas forward? Who's going to get the actual innovation work done? Okay. Now, to help you think about this, I'm going to jump ahead a slide or two here. But to help you think about this, I've got another chart for you. Okay? On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we've got all the people in your organization, and on the y-axis, we've got your time, 0 to 100%. Now, all of the time on this pie ultimately has to be split into two categories. Okay? Ongoing operations and innovation. Okay? Let's put ongoing operations on this chart first. I figure it looks something like this. Implicitly, when organizations talk about a so-called culture of innovation, they are imagining that somehow they can squeeze innovation into those tiny little slivers of slack time at the top of this chart. And again, that can work. That can be powerful, as long as what we're hoping to do is to implement a very large number of very small ideas. Okay? Anything that is too big for one person or a handful at most to do in their, quote, slack time is too big for this model. The alternative is the creation of a dedicated team. What if we tried to put the innovation work in a vertical stripe on this chart instead of on a horizontal stripe? Now, immediately, what happens when you say the words dedicated teams is at least half my audience thinks, too expensive, can't do it, can't possibly create a brand new team of people working full-time on a new idea. Okay? Well, let me push back on that just a little bit. If an innovation project costs 3 man-years of labor, it's 3 man-years of labor whether it's 3 people working full-time or 30 people each working 10% of their time. The project takes the same amount of resources either way. Okay? So that's not really a solid objection. When you create a dedicated team, you get much better focus. You get much better energy. You're not hoping that people will find a way to get things done in those tiny little slivers of slack time. But there's something far more important that you can do with a dedicated team that can't be done without it. That is, you can do some organizational redesign. You can redesign the team. You can imagine new roles and new responsibilities and new work processes. You can build something from the ground up. Now, you cannot do that with a group of part-timers that are each contributing their little slivers of slack time. And the reason that is because the demands of day-to-day operations constantly reinforce what already exists. The roles, the responsibilities, the work relationships that already exist. The truth of the matter is, you don't get breakthrough innovation without breakthrough organizational design. Now, to illustrate this, let me share with you the story of the New York Times Company and their effort to launch their internet site, New York Times Digital. Now, to understand this story, one of the things you need to understand is that New York Times Digital does very little journalism. It gets almost all of its content from its corporate parent, the newspaper, or from other third parties. Okay? This is a company that actually has more in common with a web operation, a web portal, let's say Yahoo, than it does with this corporate parent. Okay? It does very little journalism. Now let's talk about the newspaper organization for a second. It will probably surprise you not at all to hear that there's a pecking order in this newspaper organization, and that the people at the top of the pecking order are the most experienced journalists and editors. Okay, way up here, top of the pyramid. Where do you imagine that the IT department falls on this pecking order? Okay, yeah. Okay? New York Times Digital, because of its mission to take content from other sources and put it online in new formats, boy, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see that that pecking order needs to be flipped. Okay, the only journalism going on there is updating the key stories throughout the day. Okay. Now, how do you do that? Well, the only way, as the New York Times Company discovered, to do that is to create a dedicated team with a different kind of organizational structure. In the early years, New York Times Digital was run by journalists and editors, and it struggled as a result. But in the late 90s, they made a very concerted effort to hire in a whole army of internet technology experts. And by doing so, they flipped the hierarchy. I want you to know that inside the newspaper organization itself, nothing changed. We're talking about a special team with a special mission. And inside that special team, there was a very different organizational structure. And that's important because you can only do breakthrough organizational design like that inside of dedicated teams. And once again, you don't get breakthrough innovation without a little bit of breakthrough organizational design. Now, I'd like to stop here and acknowledge that when I start talking about breakthrough organizational design, breakthrough innovation, dedicated teams, usually my audiences feel like, my gosh, the degree of difficulty is going way up here. And that's true, okay? But to make you feel a little bit better about that, I'd like to call on a little bit of help from a friend of mine. You know him and love him well. This is, of course, Garrison Keillor, creator of the Lake Wobegon stories, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. Okay. Now, of course, it's a mathematical impossibility for all of the children to be above average. Colloquially, there's now something known as the Lake Wobegon effect, where a group of people systematically overestimates their ability. The more formal name for this is illusory superiority. Okay? Yeah, raise your hand if you know somebody who suffers from illusory superiority. Very good. Well, learning about the Lake Wobegon effect made me wonder one day if there's such a thing called the anti-Lake Wobegon effect. This would be where a group of people systematically underestimate their abilities. And it turns out that there is. It's rather rare, but it appears here and there. It turns out juggling is one of these areas. Most people imagine that juggling is impossible. Okay? Let me tell you, I'm the least coordinated person on earth, and somebody actually taught me how to juggle. The simplest form of juggling, understand. You can learn how to do this. It's not that hard, and yet most people imagine that they can't. Okay? The same is true of riding a unicycle, and I'm convinced the same is true in people's assessments of their organization's ability to innovate. Okay? And I know exactly who to blame for this. Okay? Here we have a company that has a marketing machine that is so powerful that it's got pretty much the entire business community convinced that they know how to innovate and we don't. Okay? let me set the record straight. Okay? Even at Apple, what you have is some success stories that they rightly feel very good about, but if you really press them on it, they wish they understood more exactly how they did it so they could do it again and again. Okay? That's the reality everywhere. Okay? Nobody has got a special lock on how to make innovation happen. It's a much more level playing field than people imagine. Now, I talked a little bit about the importance of a dedicated team. Okay? But before I get back to that, let me talk about the one reason that companies struggle with innovation above all others. And to do that, I'd like to introduce a second friend of mine. This is Innovation Man. Innovation Man is a very clever person. He comes up with great ideas all the time. But more critical than that, he's willing to do whatever it takes to see those ideas through to fruition. He'll break rules. He'll work underground. Okay? He'll nurture a conspiracy. He'll make things happen while nobody's looking. He will do whatever it takes, and in the end, he always succeeds because he is, after all, Innovation Man. Very good. I've never had that happen before. There must be a lot of... There's some call and response going on here. This may seem to you to be a silly story. Okay? And yet, I know the myth of Innovation Man, or I sometimes call it the myth of the innovator versus the bureaucratic octopus, is alive and well. Okay? And I know that because when I go around and present to companies about innovation, two of the most common questions I get are, number one, Chris, okay, how do I find the true innovation heroes in my organization? And number two, Chris, how do I knock down at least some of the barriers that I know they're going to face? Okay? So you see, there's a very natural tendency to frame the innovation challenge in terms of individual heroes fighting enormous obstacles. And that really harms us. Okay? That myth is quite toxic. Innovation is more about teamwork and special kinds of teams where everybody understands the contribution that they need to make than it is about individual heroics. The truth is, this break-all-the-rules mindset just doesn't really work. Okay? Now I'm going to give you a few reasons why. Number one, every innovator needs what I call the performance engine. Now, with more time, I'd talk more about the performance engine, but you can just think of it as the establishment, the group of people that is committed to doing what you already know how to do well, repeatably and reliably. Okay? Innovators like to think that their mission is to break that performance engine. That's wrong. In fact, they need the performance engine, in part because it is funding from the performance engine that usually pays for innovation, okay? But also because innovation almost never happens in isolation. Innovators need that performance engine. Secondly, to the people running the performance engine, break all the rules. That call to action sounds a lot like break the performance engine. You know what? If I'm working for General Motors and I'm charged with being on time and on budget and on spec every day, every week, and every quarter, and I hear some young innovator say they're going to break all the rules, my reaction is I'm going to break you. Right? This doesn't help. And finally, break all the rules sounds a lot like no rules. Innovators sometimes sound very arrogant. Okay? I don't have to follow your rules. I'm special. I'm going to do it my own way. And that's also toxic to the effort. So instead, what we've got to start with is mutual respect. That's mutual respect between innovation leaders and leaders of the established organization. And to get there, we've got to make two very important recognitions. Number one, we've got to understand, innovation leaders must understand that conflict with the performance engine, with the established organization, that's normal. Furthermore, it's not the result of people being lazy or resistant to change. In fact, it's the result of good people doing good work, trying to make that performance engine run as well as it possibly can. Conflict with the performance engine is normal. Okay. Secondly, performance engine leaders need to remember what we started out with today, and that is that no performance engine lasts forever. Okay. Both sides need the other. We need mutual respect. Now, if we're going to get beyond mutual respect, and certainly that's a good starting point, okay, we're going to need a very special kind of team, as I alluded to just moments ago. I've talked about the need for the dedicated team, but I've also said that no innovator can work alone. And in fact, the organizational model that works is one in which that dedicated team works in partnership with a subset of the performance engine I'm going to call the shared staff. In fact, let me start with the shared staff, because the shared staff is and remains part of the performance engine in this model. Nobody gets a new job. Okay? Nobody's asked to do anything different, in fact. The only thing that changes for the shared staff is that there is more work to do. Okay? So to make this realistic, we may need to add some people, not just on the dedicated team, but also on the shared staff. But beyond the need for additional people, there is literally no change for the performance engine. Let's walk over to the dedicated team. Here, I've shifted from a dark blue square to a light blue diamond to connote that we're taking that performance engine and literally turning it on its side. When you think about building that dedicated team, I want you to think as though you're building a new company or a new organization from the ground up. Nothing about what's happening over on the left may serve as a precedent. Okay? The New York Times Company eventually achieved a diamond when it brought in the huge influx of IT professionals. Okay? That's a diamond. The partnership in the middle is, as you can imagine, a difficult one to manage. It does indeed take some TLC. It does indeed take some senior level oversight to make it work. But it can work, and you must make it work, because to give up on that partnership is to give up on innovation altogether. Now, I'd like to conclude by posing one hypothetical innovation and how it would look in this model. When I got married, I married a woman in the Catholic Church, and before we could get married, we had to go to marital classes. Again, a moment of candor here. I thought these classes were not well managed. Okay? Part of the reason that I felt that way is that my participation was coerced. Really? You can't think of a better reason to attract me to the class? Secondly, because there was only one person involved in teaching, the minister. Now, with all due respect to the wisdom that that minister brought to the table, and though I wasn't happy when I arrived, I did learn some important things. I can imagine a few other types of professionals that might have something important to say about marriage. Psychologists, marriage counselors, divorce lawyers, okay. Judges, okay. Sociologists, economists. There we go. One more click. If you were serious, if you thought this was an interesting idea, creating a multidisciplinary marriage school, I think you could see very quickly that it wouldn't be organized like the church. Okay? You'd need a dedicated team with all those different kinds of professionals working together. It wouldn't be a square, it'd be a diamond. But you'd also want that partnership. Okay? Certainly, one or two of the sessions would need to focus on faith. And even for an agnostic like me, there's a lot I needed to learn about how the faith of those around me would affect my marriage. Okay? Not only that, with a good partnership here, I'll bet you that several of the participants, a good fraction of them, just might choose to have their marriage ceremony in your church. And thus a new relationship might begin, perhaps with the whole family. This is how innovation can happen. This is how it can lead to new growth in your church. Now, let me ask Sally, we're getting up towards the end of the hour. Could I take a few questions?
Yeah, just 4 or 5 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes for Q&A. The floor is yours. I'd love to hear from you. What resonated? What makes you curious? What questions can I answer? Yes, sir.
In a parish or congregation, you're working with volunteers. You don't have a paid staff.
Yes.
So you're talking about creating, I always find trouble translating from the corporate world into the parish.
Yes.
For that specific reason, what are your insights?
Yeah, I don't know that I have some great insight there, except that I can imagine that some of the services that you might innovate and create could be self-sustaining, could generate revenues that would compensate a paid staff. And I will tell you that many of the innovation examples we've looked at force people to look at compensation policies and craft new compensation policies for dedicated teams than exist in the performance engine. I think you can imagine this creates some delicate equity issues. I tell you it's part of breakthrough innovation.
Could we just follow up quick?
Yeah.
Could you imagine this using volunteers? So you have a dedicated team of volunteers that, they're not getting paid.
Yes. I can imagine doing this with a dedicated team of volunteers. And in fact, some people are more inspired to volunteer their time and energy for something that's new and exciting than something that they've been around for a long time. It doesn't strike me as something easy to do. It doesn't strike me as a showstopper either. I hope that's at least a helpful response. Thank you for the question. Maybe one or two others. Yes, sir.
It occurs to me that a great deal of this, especially the needs assessment and so on, could actually occur with 75% of people of our own membership in our church on Sunday.
You have members that aren't coming, and you'd like to deepen your engagement with those members.
That's how you would start, it seems to me.
I completely agree with you. Why not start with the circle of people that is closer to you and deepen the engagement? I'd also suggest that you might learn more and evolve in unexpected ways if you do a combination of reaching out to people who are right near you and people that are further away. Let me make a point that I probably should have made already. When I talk about innovation, people have a lot of fears about losing their identity or losing what they want so badly to hold on to. I just want to say that the model I'm showing here is not about dismantlement or destruction. It is about preservation on the left and the growth of new life on the right. Okay? It's about sustaining and growing simultaneously, two very different things. Okay? One more question, perhaps? Yes, sir.
What are the qualities you look for in people who participate in a dedicated team?
So the most important thing about somebody who participates in a dedicated team is that they have the specific skills that are needed to address the unmet need that you've identified. Okay, so for the New York Times Company launching New York Times Digital, the most important thing is that they hired people that knew something about the internet. Okay? That sounds silly, but it's so often overlooked in favor of people thinking, I need somebody who's innovative or creative. That's important too, but it's secondary. First and foremost, recognize that innovation often means building new skills and learning to do new things. You need people that are most able to adapt to that challenge. Okay? Yes, sir, and this will be the last question.
I appreciate your words between examining that relationship between the performance engine and the innovation. 2, 3 quick points maybe in
Sure.
terms of how you would nurture that particular relationship between those two dynamics. I hear that, and I'm translating it into the church that may be one of the last places in an institutional way that we still have all of our generations present on any given Sunday.
Yes.
And then we tend to channel them into their respective ages.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us 2, 3 takeaways in terms of nurturing that relationship between the performance engine and innovation?
Yeah, I'm happy to do my best. First of all, part of this is messaging that comes from the very top. And that messaging has to be comfortable with paradox. It has to say it is not only okay, but it is crucial that we do two very different things at the same time, and we support each other in that endeavor. The diamond and the square. What already exists, what you're innovating with. And in fact, we may not succeed as an organization as a whole unless we do both well. Okay? Second thing I'd say for the senior leader is that you have to be very involved where there are frictions between the two units. That maybe is less of a challenge in a congregation than it is in a 50,000 person corporation. Okay? But it's important nonetheless. Too often, right? I'm not sure what the laughter is, so somebody will have to fill me in later. Not easier. Okay, forget I said that. Okay. Sorry. Too often, senior leaders think, oh, that's just a little experiment. I really need to attend to the core business, if you will. Okay? And the experiment will die without attention from the top, especially where tensions are sharp. Okay? The last thing I'd say is the last thing you want is an innovation leader that wants to fight the system or break the rules or break the system. You want mutual respect. You want a healthy partnership. Okay? Well, good. I'd love to have more time with you, but I'm afraid I'm out of time. So let me leave you with the suggestion that I'll be here for several more hours, and I'd love to engage you in one-on-one conversations. There's more to be learned in The Other Side of Innovation, which is a traditional business book. It's full of examples from companies you've heard of. It's a commitment to read. You know, it's 200 to 300 pages, probably several hours, several sittings. And for that reason, we've taken a chapter out of the church playbook and we've created a story. And we've tried to teach through storytelling. Okay? Now, we've tried to make it really fun. How Stella Saved the Farm is a story about a farm in trouble and how it innovates to get out of trouble. It's actually a composite of all the case studies that we've put together about innovation over the last decade or so. And we're finding that when people start reading it, they finish reading it, and then they have really great conversations on the topic we've just discussed today. This book will be published on March the 12th, and I hope you'll take a look at that one as well. You've been a pleasure. Thank you.